Good crowd tonight. Good to see all of y'all. We're working on the book of Esther, lesson 7. If you don't have a lesson outline, raise your hand. One of the ushers will bring you one so you can follow along. We always give a review. Tonight we're going to make that kind of abbreviated. But basically, in case you haven't been here with us, the book of Esther occurs about 480 years before Christ. It's in the kingdom of Persia, which at that time is the largest kingdom in the world. King Xerxes is the king. Esther becomes his queen. His prime minister is Haman, who happens to hate the Jews, but especially Mordecai, who is Esther's cousin, because Mordecai won't bow down to him. And we learned from our study that Haman was a descendant of King Agag of the Amalekites, so they are historically enemies of the Jews from hundreds and hundreds of years back. Anyway, Mordecai discovers a plot to kill King Xerxes. He tells it to Queen Esther. The plot is stopped so that the perpetrators are killed, but nothing is done for Mordecai to reward him. Then you fast forward 5 years, and Haman has put out this edict and used the king's ring that all the Jews in the kingdom would be killed, and they cast lots to determine the date. It's going to be 11 months, so it'll be in the 12th month of their calendar. Anyway, so Mordecai sends word to Esther to get her to plead to the king, and she does get his attention, and she has a banquet first for King and Haman, then a second banquet for the king and Haman. But as all turns out, the king has insomnia one night and can't sleep, so he asks his servants to read the Chronicles of the Kingdom to him, and they read about this episode with Haman 5 years earlier, and the king asks what was done for Haman to reward him. And the servants say nothing, and so the king says, well, I must reward Haman for saving my life. So that morning, Haman's walking into the court to tell the king that he's built a 75-foot gallows to kill Mordecai. And one of the great chapters in Esther, the king asked Haman, what should I do for a man that I want to honor? And of course, Haman, being the proud, selfish person, is thinking, that's me. So he comes up with all these glorious things the king should do, and then the king says, great, do all those for Mordecai. So Haman knows that he's in trouble because he's wanted to kill and execute the man that the king wanted to honor. Anyway, and so then after the second banquet, or at the second banquet, the king tells Esther, so what is this request that I've now asked you 3 times for? And she says, well, basically, I would like you to save my life. And he says, what are you talking about? She says, I want you to save the life of me and my people, because there is a perpetrator out there who has basically made plans to kill me and all my people, the Jews. And, they're sitting around the table of this king and Haman and Esther, and the king says, who is this guy? And she just kind of points at Haman. So king is so mad, he runs out in his garden. Haman knows that his life is at stake, so he falls on Esther's couch, reclining couch. King comes back in, sees him on the queen's couch begging for his life, and basically kind of gives his guard the sign that Haman's history. So they cover his head up and they go hang him on the gallows that he made for Mordecai. Anyway, so that's a real quick review. It's a great story. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to read that book. It's one of the greatest stories in the Bible. So we're starting tonight in chapter 8, and we're calling this the rest of the story. There's chapter 8, 9, and then chapter 10 is very short. So we're going to try to cover these tonight and kind of get an idea of what happens after Haman is killed. So chapter 8, all these verses tonight are from the New International Version. So you have to ask yourself, okay, so after this happens, what happens to all of Haman's wealth? Obviously, he's no longer the prime minister. He's been killed, so there's a position that's open. But also, he was a very, very, very wealthy man. So what happens to his wealth? And then number 2, what happens to Mordecai? The man that Haman wanted to kill, but the king honored. So let's start the lesson with verse 1 through 3 of chapter 8. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. So basically, Mordecai now has both the power and the wealth of Haman. I mentioned in a previous lesson that I've been listening to a podcast on the history of the Persian kings and their laws to kind of help me get a little context for this story of Esther. And basically, one thing I learned is that when a person was condemned for a crime against the crown, which Haman has been, then basically his property and all his wealth reverts to the king. So that's what happened here. So all of his property and wealth immediately reverted to the crown because he committed a crime against the crown. So we learn here that King Xerxes turns around and gives Haman's wealth and property to Esther. Esther turns around and gives it to Mordecai. So all of a sudden Mordecai is a very, very wealthy man. And then also the king gives Mordecai his signet ring, meaning he gives him the power of the prime minister. So now he is the number 2 man in the largest kingdom of the world. It's kind of like Daniel was through many kings, Babylonian and some of the Medo-Persian kings. It's like Joseph was back in Egypt. So you see, God places men in positions to influence the history of his people. It's part of God's plan on how he's taking care of his people. So it's not for the glory of Mordecai, just like it wasn't for the glory of Daniel, it wasn't for the glory of Joseph. This is God's, we talk about God being kind of the unseen rudder of the ship guiding this story, and he's still doing this for the good of his people, protecting the lineage of Christ. So now we're going to skip kind of to the end of the story and to kind of talk about Mordecai just for a minute here. This is chapter 10, verses 2 and 3. So these are actually the last 2 verses in the book of Esther. And all of his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are they not written in the book of the annals of the king of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Mordecai is a very historical figure. Archaeologists have uncovered at least, the last I read, and this is from a few years back, 30 references to Mordecai as the prime minister of Xerxes' kingdom. So, again, the Bible isn't a book of fantasy, it's a book of history as well as God's Word. And Mordecai was a real person, and all these things really happened. So we know of 30 references so far. Queen Esther is mentioned. She's actually mentioned by the Greeks, who were the enemies of the Persian. They called her Amestris, which was the kind of a Greek transliteration of her word Esther. Okay, so the problem, let's go back to our story now, back in chapter 8. Here's the problem. We've mentioned it before, and Daniel mentioned it 3 times in his book, Daniel chapter 6. Remember, he was number 2 in the kingdom back when the Babylonians, before the Persians took over the Babylonians, that the laws of the Medes and the Persians, when an edict was made by the king, it was unchangeable. They could not revoke it. So here Haman is dead, but the problem is this proclamation that he got the king's signet ring to seal is still in effect. This proclamation that the Jews can be killed by any of their enemies within the entire kingdom, 11 months from the time it was made. Now we're about 2 months later in the story at this point. So let's go back to chapter 8 and kind of keep reading and see what happens. So this is verse 3 and then verse 7 and 8 of chapter 8. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. We mentioned that many of the older versions talk about hanging, but the true way the Persians put people to death was they would impale them with a sharp pole and then put their body hanging from a tall pole for all to see as a deterrent to crime. So the New International Version correctly says impaled rather than hang. So they didn't hang people with a rope like it's been done in years since. So now, Xerxes is telling Mordecai, write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So King Xerxes is recognizing that the edict that was sealed with his signet ring that Haman put out could not be revoked. So he's saying, okay, you have my permission to write any edict you want that will help protect you when this time comes in the 12th month of their calendar, and so that the Jews can protect themselves from any of the enemies that come against them. So basically, Mordecai, prime minister, he summons all the king's scribes, and so they, in the 127 provinces, there's many, many, many different nations and peoples that they have overcome, so there's many, many different languages. So he calls together the scribe. This is how they would get the word out, and basically he's dictating to all these scribes so that, all the people's languages will be represented by a scribe, so the document is put in their own language as to what Mordecai dictated. And then, of course, it's going to be sealed with the king's signet ring. So this is a new edict handed down from Mordecai, sealed by the king's ring. And then it'll be sent out to all the provinces, by courier horses. Okay, verse 10 through 13. So this is what the edict said. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them out by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of the king Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves of their enemies. So basically, Mordecai's edict that he stamped with the kings was that the Jews could defend themselves and kill anybody that came against them, and then plunder their property. So like I said, this is about the third month of that year in their calendar. So for two months, the Jews have had this fear. What if an edict was made, against you? That you're going to be executed 11 months from now. So every day that it's kind of like the clock's ticking, and there's no way for you to get out of this because it's been a king's edict. So now 2 months later, after they have 2 months of care and concern and worry and wondering what to do because they can't really escape, and so now this edict comes down that, okay, you now have the ability and the authority to defend yourself. That doesn't mean you yourself may not be hurt or harmed or killed yourself, but at least you can attempt to defend yourself and your family. So once more we see this verse. I think we brought it up every lesson. Is Proverbs 21:1 there on your lesson sheet. In the Lord's hand, the king's heart is a stream of water that he channels toward all who please him. So once again, we see God guiding this story to protect his people. Even though in the book of Esther, the name of God is not mentioned. Prayer is not mentioned. But throughout the book, we see the providential care of God for his people, guiding the decisions that are made. Okay, verse 17 and 18. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities, listen to this, this is interesting. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because of the fear of the Jews had seized them. How about that? So it's like, I want to be sure that they don't think I'm an enemy, so let's just kind of start going to the synagogue, Anyway, so this is a time where there had been a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment in the Persian kingdom. I mean, that's why Haman was able to kind of get that edict. It wasn't just him personally, but basically, apparently, there was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment. But suddenly, when this edict comes out and is sent to all the provinces, at least publicly, the anti-Jewish sentiment just kind of disappears. Now, remember, we've talked about this also, how all these different countries that have been taken over that are in the Persian Empire, most of the countries or the nationalities had their own god. It was what's called a polytheistic, a many-god society. So certainly the gods had, the God of Israel, the true God, but these other nationalities had these idols that they worshipped. But basically, they're kind of thinking, okay, this edict came out 2 months ago from the king that were all the Jews going to be killed, and now 2 months later, the king, sends out an edict that the Jews can protect themselves, and they're kind of thinking, my little God over here in the corner made out of wood hadn't ever done anything like that for me, What's he ever done? I've made all these sacrifices to him, I bowed down to him, but he's never really acted in my behalf. See, our God acts in our behalf. He's not just something on a wall or something in a corner or something on a shelf. Those are inactive, not true gods. Anyway, so chapter 9, verse 1 through 10. So on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, the king's administrators helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with a sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the city of Susa, that's the capital, they killed and destroyed 500 men, and they also killed, now it gives you 10 names, I can't say them, but verse 10 shows these are the 10 sons of Haman. Okay, so they wanted to make sure that 10 Haman's sons were all killed. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. So you can see here that basically they had help from all the government officials. Everybody knows Mordecai is the prime minister, and he's a Jew. And so we want to be in good stead as government officials, so we're going to help these Jews in case, because obviously there were some people that still hated them and wanted them dead and came against them. But the Jews had help, and it says they killed about 75,000 people throughout the kingdom, including the 10 sons of Haman. But notice that it said both on the 10 sons of Haman and their families, and it noticed throughout the kingdom, they did not plunder their enemies. They were given authority to in the edict. It said they could, because that's kind of what you did in war back then. When you defeated somebody, you basically took over everything they had. But the Jews didn't do that. They didn't need to. They were just getting rid of the enemies. They didn't really want the plunder. Commentators believe that basically, other than the complete households of Haman, because they were Amalekites, that the Jews probably only killed the men and not the women and children throughout the rest of the kingdom, and they left the plunder and the possessions so the women and children left would have something to live on. We don't know that for sure, but that's kind of what commentators assume from the writing here. Okay, what we're going to do now, a couple lessons early on, we showed clips from one of the YouTube movies on Esther. We're going to stop right here, and we're going to take up the story from about the middle of Esther to the end. It's a 27-minute segment, and then we're going to come back and talk about the Feast of Purim. So to finish out tonight, stick with me just a few minutes. We're going to read chapter 9, 20 through 28, where they're talking about this feast that is made because of the celebration of the victory of the Jews over their enemies. So Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the province of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast the pur, that is, the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be impaled on poles. Therefore, these days are called Purim, from the word pur, because of everything written in this letter and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. The Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who joined them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and every province and every city. In other words, Jews across the world. And these days of Purim shall never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. So I looked up to see when the Feast of Purim was this year, and it was February 25th and 26th. So it's called by Jews today the Feast of Purim or the Feast of Lots, because the word Purim comes from the lot that Haman cast to determine the day of their destruction. Activities during the Feast of Purim, we mentioned some of them, but at the Feast of Purim, they read aloud the book of Esther, much like in the Christmas service, we read the Christmas story. So they read the book of Esther either in synagogues or in their homes. They often dress up in costumes of ancient Jews. They often wear a mask to commemorate. Remember when Haman was finally shown to be the villain, they came and covered his head because that was the custom that the person that judged them to death, that was the last person they would see. So they covered their head until they were executed. So they often wear masks to commemorate that. They give food and drink to the poor, and they exchange food and drink with each other. One Jewish commentator I read said, this is the liveliest Jewish holiday of the year. You know, most of the other Jewish holidays are more solemn religious occasions. But you could see on the movie there, they were having a great time. This Jewish commentator said, Christians, if you can put Easter, Mardi Gras, and Halloween into one, that's Purim. In other words, this is a really rowdy celebration. Anyway, and what they say to each other, like we say Merry Christmas, they say Happy Purim. Happy Purim to each other. So, isn't that interesting? Okay, now the favorite food is what you're holding in your hand. Just like we have Easter eggs, just like we have Christmas cookies. These are called, see these little things up there? They're called Hamentashen. Hamentashen. So, you know, in the season of Purim and the weeks leading up to Purim, all the Jewish bakeries make these, and they're big sellers, just like we, like say, do the Easter eggs and the Christmas cookies. So it's a three-cornered pastry with filling, either sweet or savory, and it's the number one thing the Jews eat as they lead up and into the Feast of Purim. These little cookies date back to 1550. And there in Italy, there was what's now Italy. It was city-states back then. But there was a Jewish playwright who wrote a satirical comedy play about the book of Esther for the Feast of Purim. And so coming into popularity at that time was these three-cornered hats. You know, back in the Revolutionary time with the 1700s, the men wore these three-cornered hats. Well, that kind of started back in the 1500s. So in this play, the evil Haman, the villain Haman, was wearing a three-cornered hat, and the Jews were wearing traditional biblical costumes. And so after that, the Jews started making these three-cornered pastries to celebrate the Feast of Purim. And so there's two words for them. The most common word outside of Israel is Hamentashen, which literally means Haman's pockets. So this is, other words, remember, Haman had planned to line his own pockets full of plunder when he killed all the Jews off. So the three-cornered hat of Haman is filled with all the good stuff that he was going to get from the Jews. Now what's interesting is in Israel, they don't call them Hamentashen. The Jews in Israel call them and I came across this after I printed up the outline. Oznai, O-Z-N-A-I, Oznai Haman, which means Haman's ears. Haman's ears. And that's believed to come from the ancient custom that in some cultures, before they executed the man, they would cut his ears off just before he was executed, so he couldn't hear the good words that his family and friends would say to him as he was getting ready to be executed. And so Haman's ears are the other name for what you hold in your hand. So the meaning of all this is that basically when the Jews take a bite out of Haman's pockets or a bite out of Haman's ears, basically the Jews are overcoming this power of evil that was embodied by Haman. They're refusing to bow down to that evil. They are God's people, and evil is not going to overcome them. So there you have the rest of the story.